It's great to see you. Thank you so much for being here today. It's great to be together. We are continuing week 3, part 3 of a series we're calling Disciple. And we're putting this word sort of forward very intentionally. We're using this as our corporate one word. You'll start to see when we post our words and we've put them on the various displays in here in Leland. And our word becomes this lens through which we see our lives through. It's what we hope God will do in our lives. And then we're just kind of overlaying the direction of your formation, our formation is for us to learn to live as a disciple, a follower, a friend and follower of Jesus in the way that we live and arrange and organize our lives and ultimately the way in which we are in the world. And so we want to really focus on this and really develop an understanding. The reason is because this is the thing that Jesus has asked us to do. A lot of things get lost when we start talking about churches and church growth and all the different things that go into that. We forget that the point of the church is not to get people to come to church or to participate in our programs. It's not to make our lives better. It's to learn how to live as followers of Jesus. And so we try to get really clear on our journey, on our definition of discipleship. And we've talked about this. This is a 13, 14-year journey we've mentioned over the last couple of weeks. And so today I want to just jump in and I want to talk about this, from the definition. And specifically, I'm going to introduce you to not a new word, but maybe a new word or an old word in a new way. And so if you have your Bibles, you can turn to Matthew, but we're going to kind of dance all over the place today. So disciple is a friend and follower of Jesus, being entrained, empowered by him to love. And we tried to consolidate this and say it as concisely as we possibly can, because what we want to understand is what we've been commissioned to, what we mean by learning to live as a disciple, learning to live as one who relates to Jesus and lives under his rule. And I want to sort of expand this out this morning. And the two ideas, right, it's a friend and follower. We've talked about this. It's a follower, which sort of gives authority. And then there's a friendship. And this friendship isn't just that Jesus becomes your homeboy or that you are chummy with him or it is familiar, but it's not a familiarity that allows you to just go, oh, I know this already. That's what happens to a lot of us. We don't have a lot of context for deepening relationships over time in our culture anymore because we're too, we talked this last week, but we're too driven by productivity, efficiency, and usefulness. And when relationships stop being as useful as they could be, we sort of let them go. And so we're learning how to do something, to live in something. I think this plagues the way we relate to our kids. I think it plagues the way we relate in our marriages. It plagues the way we relate in our friendships. I don't have to, that's suffice to say. So when I thought about this, friendship produces a kind of faithfulness. When you really learn to love someone and to share trust with someone, I'm not talking about just liking them, I'm talking about you entrust them with yourself and they can take tremendous advantage of you. I used the illustration last week for my marriage. Julie and my kids, they can take tremendous advantage of me. That's a real thing. And I have to trust that they won't. And you live with that vulnerability and you live with that, but you're not gonna not give of yourself because you're afraid that someone might take advantage of you. That's what I'm talking about. And it lends itself to a kind of faithfulness. And the kind of faithfulness that I'm talking about, I'm gonna use the word fidelity. It comes from a Latin word, which just means faithful, right? That's what it means. We mostly hear this word in its inverse because we talk about infidelity, which means someone cheated on someone. But the idea is it's such a diminished view of what this word actually holds that somehow there's a kind of faithfulness in us that produces something that gives way to this idea of faithfulness, of fidelity. Fidelity literally translates faithful, but it has connective implications. It connects us to something, and it's sort of by definition relational. It's interesting that back in the 70s, high fidelity became a way we thought of music. And what they were trying to do is to take the exact sound of how something would sound live, like the Beatles or someone great like that, and they would reproduce it in a recording, and they called it hi-fi or high fidelity. What it meant, it was as close of a representation as you could get. It was as little distortion as possible. And what I want to talk about, I think that's the way to think about this definition, is that what's happening in us as we learn to be faithful to Jesus is not just that you do what he says to do. When you learn to be faithful in a friendship or to your spouse, it's not that you're just learning to behave well. It's that something actually gives way to this kind of person that you become, where you represent this faithfully, with fidelity, with no distortion. There's no manipulation. There's none of this other kind of nonsense that tends to undermine things. We live with a high degree of accuracy, in the way we bear this image that we've been entrusted with, particularly when it comes to our vocation, our call to bear the image of God. And so we represent Jesus in his kingdom. This is the commission we've been given. And we represent him in the world through our lives, in our context, the context that you've been given, right where you are, the work that you have, the relationships that you have, the upbringing you have, the experience you have. And you do that in the way in which you invest or live out in community with other people. And so I want to give us vision for that this morning. Last week I talked about the idea that friendship is about sharing responsibility for the authority that we've been given. And we know that when Jesus called us friends, he didn't call us friends because he likes us, although that's true. He called us friends because we now know his business. He's let us in on some things. It's a shared responsibility. And this requires both relational obligations. There are things that we do, we are responsible for to God, but it also has vocational obligations. There are things that we're responsible for in the way in which we operate within the world. And this gets lost in a lot of the way we talk about discipleship, and a lot of the way we talk about the gospel, and even the way we think about what it means for you to be a disciple with where you are. I mentioned a few weeks ago that when I grew up, the hallmark of being a Christian was to work in a church. So everybody's like, oh, got to be in the ministry, got to work in the church. I have come to believe, I didn't want to work in the church, to be honest with you. I spent a lot of my formative years trying to avoid working in a church. I'm still trying to figure out a way to do that, but it's just got a little more complicated over the years. There are stories behind that, and I can't tell them yet. I hope to tell them in about 4 years. I will still be here. No, this is not Mike's leaving. I just think that there's opportunities for us to do things so differently, and I'm working so hard to try to understand that. And some of the questions I'm going to ask you today, I'm going to kind of inflict you into my own personal crisis, and we can share that together, okay? So when Jesus calls the disciples, you look at this in Mark. This is all from our reading plan. Passing on the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon Peter, Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, and they were casting a net, for they were fishing. We taught this a couple weeks ago. And Jesus said, follow me, and I will make you become what? Yeah, fishers of men. This is just, talk about clarity of Jesus. Doesn't it just clear it right up? Because this is what we think. You're supposed to go out and tell people about him and get them to do what? What do you do with a fish when you catch it? You eat it, right? Is that what he's talking about? What does this metaphor mean? How do you think when Jesus calls him, this is the essence of what we get from Jesus. We get this, and this happens twice. Now I'm gonna read it again from a different passage in just a moment. But there's this idea that there are these, Jesus calls us, or he calls Simon Peter to be a fisher of man. And actually, it's not it's a fisher of mankind. It's a fisher of humanity, a fisher person of human people. That's what he's basically saying. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about this. And I've never really been able to figure out how to talk about this well. So today, if this doesn't go well, it will only reiterate that I have still not figured out a way to talk about this well. Can you stay with me on this? Because this is how Jesus invites them to follow him. I will make you into something. I will cause something in you that causes you to be something. And that's the calling. So I began to sort of let my mind work. How did Simon Peter think about this metaphor? Do you think he thought about it often? If you heard him clearly say to you, I'm gonna make you a fisher of men. Do you think that you would think about that over the time, especially if you were with him all the time? Would you ever stop and ask him, hey, Jesus, a year or so ago, when you talked to me and my brother, you said we would make us fishers of men. We're not really sure what that is, because we're not doing anything like that. We're following you around. We're feeding, what are we doing here? Do you think he ever brought it up? Have you ever thought about what it was like to follow Jesus and then what would unfold in the next 30 years of their lives? Oftentimes we read the Bible, and because it starts and ends like this, and you can read these books, some of them very quickly, it just feels like it's all collapsed together in some kind of chronological ordering where it's like, oh, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, and so there it is, it's done. And we sort of expect our lives to go the same way. Peter lived with Jesus for 3 years after Jesus said to him, I will make you a fisher of men. He lived with him. Do you think that Jesus and Peter had other conversations about that? Do you suppose that he ever asked him, hey, what did you mean by this? Am I becoming the thing that you asked me to become? Is the work that you're doing in me happening? 3 years, Peter walked with Jesus and corrected Jesus. So what I began to do is I began to just think about this. Like what would the process be like for Simon Peter to understand what Jesus meant by inviting him or calling him, commissioning him to be a fisher of human beings? And what you have to understand, so the way I did this is I read through the Gospels, the Gospel of Mark, and I read through a couple of other ones, to understand or to kind of get a sense of Simon Peter's journey. And then what you have is about 30 years. Like you get glimpses through Acts. So you get, let me just tell you what happens. Jesus invites Simon Peter to follow him. He says, I'll make you fisher of men. He's asking them, who do you say that I am? And Peter is the one who steps up and says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus commissions him and says, upon that foundation, I'm gonna build this entire movement from that confession. And then there's a point where Jesus is saying, hey, all you guys are gonna abandon me. And what does Peter jump up and say? Oh, not me. I'm gonna die for you if I have to. And Jesus says, oh, you think so? You're gonna deny me 3 times before the rooster crows, right? This is what happens. They're in the garden, they come to arrest Jesus, and Peter's the one who gives the dude a haircut. Remember this? He pulls out his sword and he cuts the dude's ear off. It's not because he was trying to cut his ear off, it's because he was trying to cut his head off and he missed. He's a fisherman, not a swordsman. So this is what Simon Peter's doing. Is he following in the way of Jesus? What is he learning? What is he seeing? He denies Jesus and he feels ashamed. He's restored over breakfast at the end of John chapter 21, and he emerges as a leader in Pentecost. And he's having to deal with what's happening in this early movement, and you see him having to navigate with Paul, but him and Paul have heated arguments about how Judaism and Gentiles how this is all gonna work together. And so this is Peter, this goes on for years, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And then we get in the very back of your Bibles, we get these 2 letters that are written probably, a few years apart, but sometime 35 years after, maybe almost 40 years after, he hears this call to, hey, follow me and I'll make you a fisher of men. How do you think Peter would have understood that? The question is, what do the disciples see Jesus doing? And they see him feeding miraculously. They see him healing miraculously. They hear his teachings. What do they learn from his teachings? What do they learn? They hear the Sermon on the Mount. They hear, take up your cross and follow me before Jesus went to the cross. They had no context to understand what would happen from here. And so 30 years later, we get insight, 35 years later, we get insight into what Peter is thinking. I mean, the questions are, how would Simon Peter come to understand his calling after the death and resurrection of his rabbi? Have you ever thought about that? Because it changed. It became something. How would that impact the way in which they would carry out their lives in this vocation? And how their beliefs would unfold and take shape because of the teaching and the life and their following, and then his death and resurrection, and then having to live on taking cues or walking with this spirit that God would send to them. These are questions that we should wrestle with. And so what you see 30 years later is Peter would describe this. Here's the phrase he uses. This is in his first letter, the very beginning of it. He says, we have been born again into a living hope. You're like, do you know what Peter was probably thinking? He heard John I want the scriptures to come alive to you. This isn't just like Peter probably heard, and John, these guys were talking. They recount the story of Jesus and Nicodemus when Jesus would tell this religious leader, unless you are born again, you cannot inherit the kingdom of God. And so here's Simon Peter recording this 30 years later. You're born again into living. He's using this language. He's preparing his church, the people who follow Jesus, for difficulty and hardship. And he says these are actually ways in which our faith is refined. We come to learn things about an eternal perspective in ways that we can't when our lives just work the way we want them to. He talks about being an Exodus people who are delivered from slavery. He talks about being a covenant people who live under this new covenant that was given to Jeremiah. He talks about being a temple people. These are all themes and things that he is setting up for the church to understand. He says to be aware and alert and sober-minded. He implores those who are learning to follow Jesus 30 years later to think, to consider. He encourages us as sacrifice and hardships are required in our life. This is just my quick list of 1st and 2nd Peter. He says to be on guard and to be diligent against things that undermine our influence or that misrepresent God's heart. To be on guard, to wage war against them. He says to be on guard against chasing pleasure and careless indulgence. That's what he tells us. This is how his faith, his vocation as a fisher of men would take shape over the course of his life. He tells us to get rid of malice and deceit and the petty competitiveness that makes us do terrible things to one another. He says you got to learn how to live in the world that you were in. Peter, 30 years later, trying to live out his vocation as a fisher of man, is saying you have to learn how to live in the world that you were in. That's an important thing for us to do because there are ways in which you can live in this world. You can amass your own personal sort of fortress and protect yourself from all the things that plague the rest of the world. Lots of options here. And then he says this, he says, don't conform to the world. Like, did he hear this from the Apostle Paul when Paul would write this in Romans 12, right? There's overlapping. These people knew each other. They're having conversation about this, and now they're trying to record this and give this to people who are trying to follow Jesus in very difficult circumstances. Don't be conformed. Instead, be distinct, so that people will see your good works and then glorify God. Do you think he pulled that from the Sermon on the Mount? Let your light so shine, Jesus said, before men that they will see your good works and they will glorify your Father who's in heaven. And Peter's 35 years later going, yes, I'm starting to see what that means. And we're gonna commission other people that are in our community to start to do this. And so this is why I want us to think about this. If you were to ask Peter today, and I just sort of let my imagination run, Simon Peter, if you're interviewing him, how, like a podcast or something, how did you become a fisher of mankind? What did that mean to you? And I imagine Peter's probably calmed down a lot. He doesn't yell at me as much. He doesn't pull out a sword and threaten me or run off at the mouth, but he's maybe more measured as he's learned to live and endure some things over the 30 years since. And he says, you know what, it's the role of a fisherman is this kind of gathering that requires tremendous persistence and patience and sensitivity. And so this is this new kind of gathering that is required for a new kind of life. It's a way in which we learn to live together and to work together. And it requires a way for us to think about the way in which we are in the world and to think about how we will actually live in this world. And he would say things like this: as strangers and exiles in a foreign land. Like we live in this place that we don't fit and that our value systems are different and our ways seem to be contrary, seems to be upside down. And so I want to turn and ask you the question, what might your vocation be as you follow him? Because most of us think that you should read the Bible, hear a few messages, you should get it, and then you should execute on what you get. And I can't say strongly enough that is not how this is going to work. In fact, I would be so bold as to say, if this is how it's worked for you, you're probably wrong. And I talk to people all the time. Oh, the gospel's simple. Boom, you do this and you do this and your life works. I'm like, really? Like, who do you know? Besides the 3 people that hang out with you. Because it's not how it works. The people I meet have questions and they wrestle and things happen to them. And we wonder and we can't figure it out. And all the while, Jesus is saying, I'm Lord and I'm on the throne and I rule and I've invited you to come underneath my reign. And we're like, we don't see that. He said, you got to reorient yourself. And he tells us, you got to, as strangers and exiles, we live in this world in a particular way. I just don't know that we have an imagination that allows us to see this. I mean, again, I don't want to be crass, but growing up, what I mostly heard was that you either went in the ministry or you went and you worked and made a lot of money so you could give a lot of money to the church. And that was kind of your options. You could do that, I'm just kidding. But here's the thing. Your vocation, and I don't just mean your job, I mean your whole self. We talk about integrity, integration, your whole self. Your vocation matters. I don't think it's a loss that Jesus said, I will take your occupation and cause that occupation to work in the kingdom. Because there are things in which you do that actually matter, the way in which you live in this world and navigate this world. And so the question that I want to ask you is, how might your vocation shape? How might he take your skills? I want you to look at this. Your skills and your personality and your gifting and your passion. How might he take those things and make you into an image-bearing citizen in this upside-down kingdom? That means that somehow you've got to understand your skills. You can't say, oh, shucks, I don't really have anything. No, you've been granted something, graced with something. Your passions, do they need to be shaped or formed? Are you passionate about things that are consistent with bearing God's image in his way in this world? Are you passionate about this? Like, if not, we taught this, your passions need to be formed, they need to be shaped. We need to be able to see things and learn things. We'll talk about how to do this in just a minute. I'm going to start reading from Matthew, and the reason I want to do this is because each of the Gospels end very differently. John ends with kind of a commission, and he's like, peace I give to you. This is the one where he breathes on them. Peace be with you. And he breathes on them. If you remember that from Easter. If you don't, you have to go listen. It's very funny. And then he says, as the Father sends me, so I send you. Luke ends almost as a Acts and Luke overlap because he wrote both of those books. So it's like, you're gonna be witnesses, and then he starts off with, you're gonna be witnesses. You're gonna wait, and you'll be witnesses. You're gonna wait and be witnesses. And Acts and Luke overlap. Mark ends very strangely. In fact, if you open your Bibles there, what you'll likely see in the book of Mark is you'll see the fact when it ends, it'll end at verse, I believe it's 8 or 9. Let me find it here real quick. Mark chapter 16 ends in verse 8, and this is how it ends. Trembling and bewildered, Jesus has just rose from the dead, and they've encountered Jesus. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and they fled from the tomb, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. No commission, no nothing. And then you'll see a note, and it's more than likely it's italicized in your Bibles, and it says the earliest manuscripts do not contain verses 19 through 20. I remember reading this when I was taking seminary classes. I'm thinking, does this mean the Bible's not true? Because these are places in here and it says this wasn't in there. And what you realize is it's very strange. And this ending was likely added later for a concise story. People think maybe Mark didn't finish. So I'm saying this not to go, listen, I've been doing this a long time. My confidence in the scriptures is increasing the more I study, not diminishing. Things like this do not bother me at all anymore, at all. So if you're like, oh, I don't know, just maybe you can use some of my faith right now, because I'm telling you, these are the things that you need to understand. Because they're each trying to do something distinctly different. You're gonna read through Mark, you're gonna read all the way to the end, but you're gonna notice that a lot of people think it just ends in verse 8. So Matthew ends. And Matthew's interesting because Matthew actually tells about the conspiracy of Pilate paying off the guards who let Jesus get away, because he said, you got to tell them that the body was stolen and we're going to pay you to do this. How might Matthew have gotten that detail and no one else did? Matthew was a tax collector. He was in cahoots for much of his life with the Roman government. He probably had friends. Like, do you see this? Like, each one is saying something different. So then Matthew comes to the very end and he closes like this. This is what is known. Before I do that, I got just a few minutes. Let me back up. So Matthew also records this calling of Simon, Peter, and Andrew. And here's how he does it. This is Matthew 4. While walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and his brother Andrew. He was casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. I just love they both include that. Like we weren't tracking. And then he says this, follow me, and you've seen this, we've looked at this, follow me. And then Jesus says, I will make you fishers of men. And what's important is he says, I will make you. This is, and I'm not a Greek scholar by any stretch, but this is the Greek word poeo. And it comes from the word make or cause. So Jesus is causing things. He's giving our vocation. He's causing whatever this calling is to happen in us. And we need to have some understanding of this, because to be empowered, right? To be empowered by him has two meanings. And one is that he serves as a source for this work in us. The second thing that I want for us to flip over to really quickly, and I did this in the first series, but I want you to see this. At the very end, when Matthew is commissioning the disciples, when he is gathering them together, he's about to leave. He says, now the 11 disciples went to the mountain of Galilee where Jesus had directed them to go. He said, I want to meet you here. And then when he gets there, when they get there together, it says, when they saw him, they worshiped him. But what? Oh, but some weren't so sure. Doesn't that give you a little bit of confidence? Because you don't show up and immediately go, oh, I'm in. You show up and go, how can this be? And you're still there with him and you still get kind of the commission. Because what Jesus says to them next, the way Matthew records this, is all authority on heaven and earth has been given to me. And it's really powerful that it's in heaven and on earth. It's here and here. This is the prayer that he was praying. Lord, let your will be done here on earth as it is in heaven. And all this authority has been given to me. Go, therefore. This is literally as you are going, right? As you are going. As you live your life. I want you to make these friends and followers of Jesus. And this is a longer word. Matheteo, probably pronouncing that incorrectly. But this means something different. And what I want to address as we close our time, I want to give you some things to imagine. When he tells us to go and make disciples, he's training us and he's empowering us, that he's causing certain things to happen. To train, you know what to train means. To train means you have to do things in the real world that reorient you to a particular way of life. The way I would say it is, training is making your heart and your mind and your body do things in order to orient or reorient and adapt to a new way or a new desire. So when I wanted to be a runner, I tried to run years ago. To all you marathoners, hats off to you guys. One of the New Year's resolutions I never fulfilled. Still ashamed of it. But I remember I used to run a ton. And I remember when I first started to be a runner, I remember thinking like, when do I get to say that I'm a runner? You ever thought about this? Because if you don't run, you can't say you're a runner. Even if you have like Hoka shoes or whatever, you can't just say that. But here's what I did. The very first thing that I did is I went out and I bought me a new watch. And this is back in the day of MP3 players before like iPhones and such. And I had my MP3 player loaded with like Eye the Tiger and those kinds of things. And I bought me some shoes. And you're gearing up. And then what you do is you're like, dude, you're all fired up. This is gonna feel so good. And you get out and you start running. And you like start running and you're feeling good for about 12 steps. My shoes are comfortable, I'm feeling good. And you're like, I did not know the eye of the tiger was 17 minutes long. And you're trying not to look at your watch because you gotta swear you've been running for 20 or 30 minutes. You know, it's like 3 minutes and your side's killing you. And you know what you say? I'm not a runner. I'm not cut out for this. And you quit. And what you have to do if you're gonna be a runner is you have to get up, you have to do it again the next day. And you have to do it again the next day. They have couch to 5Ks, you walk and you run. All these things, and what are you doing? You're training, you're making your mind and your body and your heart orient itself and experience things that you want or intend. That's what training is. So we train ourselves in the way of Jesus by learning how to see differently and think differently and respond and react differently. When Jesus said, if someone does this to you, don't respond with vengeance, but instead offer this to them. We don't naturally think like that, just like we don't naturally get off the couch and want to go run for no reason. So you have to train yourself in these ways. That's what training is. But it doesn't stop there because it's not just training, it's something that God causes us to be. There's a different kind of making in the way Jesus turns us into these kind of human gatherers or catchers, that he is creating our vocation within his rule in order to bring his will here on earth just the way that he intends it to be. Have you allowed him to do that? Have you allowed him to shape your vocation into what he intends for you, what he intends for how you are to live within this world? When you're training yourself, real quickly, give you a couple practices, and I got a couple minutes. We'll put these up there. Number one, this is what I would suggest. Do the Mark reading plan. To orient yourself, to just get disciplined in reading the Bible and thinking about things. Use the accompanying devotions. Number two, these are just pick one and practice it. Write out your prayers. So like you're in your car and you pray and you know you pray, but like maybe take 5 or 10 minutes and write them down. Put them in your phone on your notes section. Write out your prayers and then pray them. This was a light bulb moment for me. I'd write out my prayers all the time. Then I would stop and I'd go back and read and pray what I wrote. It's an extraordinary experience. It's taken me years and years and years and years and years. You don't pick up Isaiah and read early apocalyptic, what word am I even trying to say there? Revelatory Jewish literature, right? Apocalyptic, that's the word I was looking for. And just understand it immediately, any more than you go look at some abstract painting by some famous artist in a museum and go, oh, I get it. You have to incline yourself, you have to train yourself to this. The Bible is a different pacing the way we read. Praying is a different speed and a different way that we communicate. Develop a consistent devotional life. Maybe use something, resource that you have. A consistent prayer life. There's lots of devotionals. Maybe it's a consistent contribution in community. Maybe you just need to go serve somewhere. Some of you, every place that you are, you're always in charge and you're always making things happen. You're always the one making decisions. Go volunteer in Grow Zone, where you make no decisions. You respond to what this crying baby is doing, right? It's a way for you to posture yourself in a way that's different. And you do it over time. And you're training yourself. So now we talk about being empowered. This means that we are both entrusted and sourced, that you're not left to your own devices to just go muster up enough willpower to go and do this on your own. But it also isn't passive. You're just like, I'll just let go and let God. That's a great phrase, and that's necessary and sometimes, but Jesus invites us to follow him. It's not passive. We're learning how to trust. We're learning how to trust in ways that allow us to step into places, and sometimes we're trusting him in ways in which we need to resist or back off or not force or not say anything. But it's learning how to walk with him and learn from him. What you will find when you do this is you're gonna find that he is extraordinarily faithful and he is more capable than you can imagine. That's what I've discovered in 35 years of trying to walk with him. And he can do things that are disproportionate to the effort that you put. There are times when I have done everything I can and it's to no avail. And then somehow, some way, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years or 8 years later, this happens, and I had long since, and it was a seed that got planted, and somehow it did something. You'll be surprised at what happens when you consistently walk with him. You'll be amazed at what happens. So here's my question. Have you imagined your life as an image bearer? That's your vocation. Entrusted and empowered to bring something of God's redemptive and restorative intention into the world. And you're like, nope, don't even know what restorative intentions are. So you know what you do? You seek and you knock and you ask. Whoever seeks will find. Whoever knocks, the door will be open. Whoever asks, it will be given to them. This is the kind of thing Jesus was talking about. He forgives us of our sin to restore us into a relationship with him that fuels the kind of future that he wants to create. The reason I take sin so seriously is not because I want to be moral. I want to be used. I want it to be fuel. I want to think about what it means for my life to bring about redemptive intention and restorative intention in the world in which we live. And I don't think we've been taught or trained or given permission to just get some imagination about it. Let yourself dream about this. How might God use you in those ways? And if you don't know what his redemptive intention is, I'll just tell you real quick. He intends for shalom. All justice is a redemption of shalom. And it's not just peace like the world gives. It's where things are rightly related to one another. So if you want to try to start exploring what redemptive and restorative intent looks like in your life, start here. Where is it that there's division between you and your relationship with God? Are there sin patterns? Where are they? What are they? I've had them, still have them. There's always times that I'm wrestling with, Lord, I want to be reconciled. Do you want to live out of this? Sin doesn't leave you alone. It doesn't get easier. It becomes more subtle. I thought when I stopped cussing, that I'd be perfect. And you realize, whoa, there's a whole lot of things to work on after that. And it's like no matter what so it's this idea where we learn how to live governed by his rule. Like just test yourself. What about your relationship with others? Are there places and gaps where this is happening? How do you work and bring restorative intention into those places? In your relationship with yourself, I think I got this backwards. But a lot of us, we live so disintegrated. And listen, please hear me. This is not like, oh, you should feel bad. That's useless. This is, hey, let's look at this and say, God, could you do something here? And I'm telling you, he can and he will. Like, where's disintegration? Can you trust him enough to take those steps to follow him and see him make you into this kind of person? Your relationship with the world in which you live. This is hard. You know what the default relationship we have with the world around us is to complain about it. It's hard because it's easy to complain. But what if we could see something different? What if we could live as strangers and aliens who abstain from the mire and who learn how to live out in such a way that our light shines and people begin to say, hey, there's something slightly different about those friends and followers of Jesus. Can I keep you like 2 more minutes? Okay, sorry. Then I'm gonna finish. When Jesus said to make disciples, he doesn't say go beat people over the head. I can do it. I can do it. I got good messages. I could blow us all up, man. But ours is not a message of persuasion in that way. We're not trying to convince people by information and logic. To make disciples is to be a disciple in such a way that it causes. It allows Jesus to cause. Should you be ready to give a witness? Of course you should. Should you be ready to give, the reason for the hope that you have? Of course you should. But it's reason for the hope that you have, not evidence for why this person is wrong and you're right. We don't operate like that. Ours is a message of invitation. Come and see and experience and learn to trust. You're going to be in a group, in a community where trust is valued above almost everything else. And you're going to step in, you're going to be a little bit skeptical or a little bit hesitant. And we're just saying, keep coming, keep showing up. We believe that you have to belong in order to become. And what you'll find is that in this trust, that you'll be persuaded, not that we're correct in our positions, but that this kind of life that we're seeking to live is actually real and it's actually available. That's how you make disciples. That people really can and do treat one another in a particular way, and people can and do see one another in a particular way, and people can and will see the world in a particular way, and it's real, and it becomes evident. That is our witness. And it's because we have come to know of God's love, and we live in a deep friendship with the Father, the Son, sharing unity in God's Holy Spirit. And that becomes true that we live out as friends and followers of Jesus, being trained and empowered by him to love. I know it was a lot. On your outlines, you've got that question about your vocation. And I'd spend time trying to figure out what am I gonna do this week to begin to train myself? And I would spend a lot of time, not just in my own world about your vocation, but with people around you. If you're on teams in business and you have other followers of Jesus with you, start asking and thinking. You don't have to go and make your company logo a Christian logo or have a Bible study. You need to say, Lord, how can we bear witness and bring restorative intention and redemptive intention in every place that we exist to be a disciple in such a way that we cause other people to become the same. Jesus, thank you that you have chosen to make us fishers, whatever this vocation of gathering humans within this way. Thank you that Simon Peter came to see this in a particular way that really does mean something to us and help us to consider and to imagine what it might mean in our context, with our personality, with our skills, with our resources. Father, I ask you that you would do that so that we might live as sort of a beacon of hope, of redemption and restoration in a world that just keeps getting pulled more and more apart at the seams. Would you do something distinctly different in us? And I pray all this in your name, amen.